Is it time for Sony to invest in some first-party, single-player shooter games? Off the top of your head, what was the last first-party, first-person shooter game? Okay, I mean, when was the last first-party, first-person shooter single-player campaign with a multiplayer component? Off the top of my head, it's Killzone Shadowfall way back in 2013 as a PS4 launch title. Right now, Sony doesn't have a prominent first-person shooter to call its own and has been relying on like Call of Duty being more popular on PlayStation than Xbox this generation as a reason to not even bother competing anymore. Helldivers 2, while not as popular as when it launched due to controversies, is a third-person shooter game with no campaign. It just seems like a market for Sony, especially since, ever since The Last of Us has shifted into, over-the-shoulder, cinematic, third-person action kind of games. And while that has certainly worked wonders for them with the likes of God of War, Spider-Man, like Horizon, there's been no push for developing more shooter games. During the PS3 era, Sony had two popular first-person shooter franchises that were synonymous with PlayStation. First up is Killzone.
These comms are getting worse. Anyone else receiving?
While Killzone 1 didn't exactly light the world on fire with its PS2 release way back in 2004, it was still a competent shooter in its own right, even if it wasn't, directly competing with, like, Halo. Now, in 2009, the PS3 was hitting its stride and becoming the fan favorite of the generation at the time. I still look back at those E3s with like Kevin Butler as some of my favorites of the conventions. E3 2005 especially had people hyped when they showed a glimpse of what Killzone 2 was going to look like, on PS3, and it blew everyone away. While not an exact 1-to-1, in 2009 when Killzone 2 was released, it still blew everyone away.
The history of these days will be written in blood. By crushing the armies of our enemy, by seizing the weapons they thought to turn against us, we were fighting for our very existence. But if there are those who would deny us peace, refuse us our rightful place in the universe, then we will unleash such terrible vengeance that generations yet unborn will cry out in anguish.
A spokesman for ISA High Command had this to say on Basari's latest outburst.
The game still looks amazing today, and I still think looks better than some shooters released today, and sold more than 1 million copies within a month. Even the multiplayer was holding its own against the behemoth that was Halo 3 at the time. Ending on one hell of a cliffhanger, it was only 2 years later that we got Killzone 3.
On this day, as our enemy ships burn away in orbit, as our bodies lie broken in our streets, we are once again reminded of the depths of their depravity.
Very similar in terms of gameplay to its immediate predecessor, with more varied environments and biomes, with an improved melee combat system, it was a worthy successor to Killzone 2. With the launch of the PS4, they had Shadowfall.
Vecta, home of those responsible for Helgen's destruction. Half of the planet was given over to the survivors, and the Vectans that lived there were forced to leave. This was no longer their home.
Why, and it's impressive because it was only 2 years later in 2013, and Guerrilla Games was able to get it out for launch. Now, while in my opinion the story and gameplay were fairly average across the board and didn't look like a significant jump in terms of fidelity between the console generations, the game still sold over 2 million copies in its first year. This would be the last we would hear of Killzone, sadly, as in 2015 they revealed that they were working on a new IP, Horizon Zero Dawn, and Guerrilla Games has been working on that franchise for the last 9 years, leaving Killzone in the dust, maybe to never be heard of again. And that brings me on to PlayStation's other phenomenal first-person shooter exclusive franchise, Resistance. In its first year, the PS3 was struggling with its higher price tag and harder to develop for games. One exclusive launch title stands out and is still a banger to play to this day. Resistance Fall of Man, released on November 17th, 2006 as a launch title. Developed by Insomniac Games, who previously worked on the Ratchet & Clank games and are now pretty much balls deep in developing Marvel games like Spider-Man and the upcoming Wolverine game. Now, while the multiplayer wasn't as good as Killzone, in my opinion, its single-player campaign, I'd argue, was even better, and can also be played in split-screen co-op. What set this shooter apart from others was its intriguing setting, set in an alternate history where aliens called the Chimera invaded Earth in the 1950s. Having a weapon wheel to try out a ton of different guns instead of just swapping between two and a sidearm was a breath of fresh air at the time. It rewards experimentation, and the Chimera's weapons are still some of the most unique in the genre. The Bullseye is one of my favorites, which makes sense considering how cool the weapons were in Ratchet & Clank.
Get off me! Easy, Sergeant! It's harmless.
Resistance 2 was a step back, sadly, as Insomniac tried to match the conventions of other shooters and forgot what made Fall of Man unique in the first place. You could only carry 2 weapons at a time again, and had a much shorter campaign with a ton of disappointing boss fights that just felt more scripted than the original. The multiplayer was better, however, but it wasn't enough to save it.
90% of the world's population had been killed or converted by the Chimera. Those of us remaining did what we could to remind ourselves we were human. Susan and I found each other, fell in love. We both wanted to forget the past. We vowed to stop fighting and start living. I kept that vow as long as I could.
Resistance 3 was a damn good course correction, and even had a change of protagonist from Nathan Hale from the first 2 games. No story spoilers, gotta check them out yourself, wink wink. The weapon wheel was also brought back, and it shows just how much it was needed to make these games shine. The Insomniac CEO at the time, Ted Price, said, all the changes in Resistance 2, quote-unquote, may have not been a good thing, and that on Resistance 3, we went back to some of our more traditional core mechanics that players did love, and then built a story that was more personal. We're really proud of Resistance 3, end quote. I personally love Resistance 3, but sadly that improvement didn't translate to sales, and the series fizzled out with the 3rd entry and the poorly received, PlayStation Vita spin-off, Resistance Burning Skies, which I also thought was a damn good PlayStation Vita game. It was up there with like Golden Abyss, Uncharted Golden Abyss. And that's just the end of the shooters on PlayStation. So, and thus endeth the tragic tale of 2 massive popular Sony shooter franchises from the PS3 era. It's a shame Sony has moved so far away from the genre, as I feel first-person shooters are like a dying breed now, unless your name is Call of Duty, or if you're the flavor of the week hero shooter. There's a market right now that I think is itching for something different than just more modern military shooters in the style of Battlefield and Call of Duty. And at one time or another, Sony was the company providing these experiences, besides obviously Bungie with Halo. Here's hoping they go back to making some of them again one day.